All right, everybody, welcome back. Today, this lecture is going to be about the Clean Air Act and what it means today. Last time we left off talking about the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990. We're going to delve into them a little bit more today. This is a lot of information. I'm going to do my best to make this as concise as possible. I'm also going to refer you to a lot of the specific websites given by the EPA because all of the great information on the Clean Air Act is available there. All right, before we get too far underway with the Clean Air Act, just a few brief words about your exam number 2, which is due next Tuesday, April 7th, I believe it is. Yes, April 7th. So your exam is very broad and very open-ended. You are going to propose 3 amendments to the Clean Air Act, and each one should include a justification for the amendment based on what we've learned in class to date. So this is an opportunity for you to really show me what you've learned in class and what research you can do on your own all the way back to the beginning of the semester. And the motivation for this is our current real-time situation. As we've all moved to our home and reduced the number of miles we're traveling and the number of things we're doing in the world, there has been a drastic improvement in air quality, particularly in Italy and China. If you look at the air quality news section of Blackboard, you'll see news articles about both of those improved air quality. I want you to use that as your starting point and think about what's happening right now and how our behavior change has had such a drastic impact on such a short period of time. And with that as your starting point, tell me how we can make the Clean Air Act differently. And I want you to try 3 different ways. I want this to be at maximum 10 pages. Shoot for 5. Okay, 5 to 10 pages maximum to cover your 3 amendments. If you have any questions, email me, pop into office hours, anything like that along this week. I am very happy to oblige. Okay, so just picking up from where we left last time, the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990. This is the version of the Clean Air Act that we operate under today. And why this is huge is because it saw a major shift in philosophy and a huge, big set of amendments. In 1990, the whole act was almost rewritten. And what motivated that is that we decided we weren't doing well enough. There were still 96 cities in non-attainment for ozone, 41 in non-attainment for carbon monoxide, and 70 in non-attainment for PM10. So what the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990 did was keep the definitions and standards for the NAAQS, the new source performance standards, and the prevention of significant deterioration clauses, but it added different classifications for non-attainment areas. And each class was given its own timetable for each attainment. So it was no longer just you're not in attainment and you have to reach it this way. It was based on how badly you were not in attainment. So if you were in an extreme, you had to meet the NAAQS by 2010, severe by 2007, and mild by 2005. And I'm sorry, I didn't fix this slide, even though you just saw me say it needed to be fixed in the last video. It also saw a change in the philosophy on regulating the control technology. Prior to this, it was the lowest achievable emissions rate by, or the new one is the lowest achievable emissions rate by adopting reasonable achievable control technology. In the 1977 version, it said best available control technology. So we moved to this terminology of reasonably achievable control technology. And this was a concession in some ways to the economic realities. The best is not always the affordable one. And the biggest change, so the biggest change that we saw in this structuring of the Clean Air Act was an entire restructuring of the titles. So the current Clean Air Act is written in 5 groups. You can think of these as chapters, Title 1 through 6, actually 6. Sorry, I misspoke there for a second. It's organized into 6 titles. The first one is all about prevention and control. This is the heart of the act. It's where non-attainment areas are classified. It's where new and amended NAAQS were put in. And the new and amended NAAQS are always needed to be attained in 5 years and with a possible 5-year extension. all of the mobile source information, so anything that's moving is considered a mobile source, was put into Title II. A lot of specifics were added into the Title II of the Clean Air Act. The most notable ones were rules about gas reformulation and onboard diagnostic systems, or OBDs. You may not be aware, but everybody's car now has a computer in it that is diagnosing its emissions. They diagnose a lot more problems with your car, but they were originally required for emission standards. And Title II also put in tighter tailpipe standards with the 1990 amendments. Title III is the general toxics, a part of the Clean Air Act. This is the list of the HAPs, the hazardous air pollutants. It requires maximum achievable control technology for the HAPs, and it also established the Chemical Safety Board for the prevention of accidents with spilling of general air pollutants. Title IV is the acid deposition control title. This was where electric utilities are regulated. It allocated allowances for SO2 emissions. It put things in two phases. 110 electric utilities were under the phase one rules that went in effect in 1995, and then another 2,000 in the year 2000. This is also where we see the cap and trade controls, that if a utility reduces SO2 below their allowances, they could sell it to another utility. There's also some specific NOx emission reductions in Title IV. It's just a note here, you'll find as you dig into the Clean Air Act that the original Title IV was noise pollution, and it was left as Title IV noise pollution. And so now it's kind of a sub-chapter of the new Title IV, acid deposition control. So it's Title IV-A. Title V is where you find all the information about permits, about how new and existing sources must obtain permits for their emissions. And Title IV is also where it requires the states to develop and implement a permitting program under EPA approval. So a state has to make a plan, a permitting plan. If EPA doesn't like it, EPA can take over. Title VI is where all the stratospheric ozone policies are, and this was what dictated a complete phase out of CFCs. And then Title VII, which I don't have on this slide, again, I apologize. Title VII is the enforcement title, where it outlines that larger penalties are allowed than were previously. And there are a couple of other titles that allow the continuation of research, such as the Federal Acid Rain Program, and talk about visibility in national parks, and also part of a Job Training Partnership Act to retrain employees laid off from the Clean Air Act regulations. After this 1990 amendments, the only major change, or only change to the Clean Air Act was in 1997, which revised and modified the NAAQS for ozone and PM and added PM 2.5. And since that time, they have modified the NAAQS on a couple of occasions, and you'll see that later on in this presentation. So just briefly, you should be watching this video now. This is a screen capture I took navigating the EPA website. I wanted to show you a little bit that the entire Clean Air Act, the text of it is available for you to see. So let's start off here with the congressional findings. So the Congress finds the predominant part of the nation's population is located in rapidly expanding metropolitan and urban areas. Sorry, I videoed too fast there. But this is all the text that talks about the Clean Air Act. And the introductory text has a lot: spill controls, radon gas, air quality research, noise control, study of regional air quality. There's a lot of information here, even about how the railroad emission study was part of formulating the Clean Air Act. And each title has its section listed about grant supports. There's a whole section on interstate air quality agencies, the air control regions. Each state has primary responsibility for the designated regions. Regions are classified either by their attainment or non-attainment of the NAAQS. This is also a fairly long section of the Clean Air Act that talks about all of the different criteria pollutants here. So there's a lot of redundancy you'll see, but every part of the act is important and needs to be regulated. There's the Ozone Protection Act. And if you go here to Part C about the prevention of significant deterioration, this is the part that says we can't get worse. The purpose is we can't get worse. It gives initial classifications, increments and ceilings, how areas can be redesignated, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of rules. The Clean Air Act is a big, messy map. Initial classifications, all places were given an initial area as Class 1 or Class 2. And here's the plans. So how do you make a plan? And what do you need to do to make that plan? So, big, long act with a lot of information in it. What does this boil down to? Who does what? The real important part of what the Clean Air Act lays out is this partnership between who is responsible for getting the air clean and where can we regulate it from. So the EPA, as the federal level, sets the limits, and it sets a minimum limit. It also is responsible for approving plans, and it is able to assist the states, tribal, and local agencies in developing those plans or giving them any technical or scientific assistance that they may need in developing their plans. The state and local governments, so here in South Carolina, that falls to DHEC. There's one an equivalent in every state. They are really taking the lead in carrying out the Clean Air Act. They're the day-to-day, on-the-ground regulators for the Clean Air Act. And they are responsible for monitoring the air quality. They're responsible for performing inspections of mobile vehicles or putting limits on what mobile vehicles can emit. They are also the enforcement of the Clean Air Act and enforcing emission standards for stationary or mobile sources. And the state and local government is responsible for developing the State Implementation Plan, or more briefly referred to as the SIP. The SIP is the plan that every state or local agency needs to put together to get back into attainment. Tribal nations are given separate authority in the Clean Air Act. As you may or may not know, tribal nations have an interesting role legally. What happens on tribal land is subject to different rules. So tribal nations were told to make rules or allowed to make rules, and they were the implement and enforcer on tribal lands. As we've talked about, air pollution is a non-boundary problem, so it was important to have tribal nations involved in the Clean Air Act. Just a quick review. This is what Title I lays out, the air pollutants of concern. Our favorite 6 criteria pollutants there: carbon monoxide, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen dioxide, particulate matter, ozone, and lead. Also the air toxics and those for visibility. Okay, so I've thrown these 2 terms around a little bit, or actually all 3 of these terms around a little bit, and I want to formally define them here. In the Clean Air Act, every location is in one of 3 categories. Attainment, meaning that the air in that location meets all of the NAAQS. They are always in compliance with the Clean Air Act. Their ambient level is below those levels set. Non-attainment means the NAAQS are not met. These are areas that need to have their air cleaned up in some way. And maintenance areas are areas that used to be in non-attainment. So if you were in non-attainment at one point in time, you submitted a SIP, your SIP was approved, you implemented your SIP, and now you are in attainment status by the numbers, you are technically in maintenance, and you stay in maintenance for a certain amount of time. The idea behind this being you still have to submit SIPs, you still have to implement monitoring and regulation programs, maybe to an extent more than attainment areas. Areas that are in attainment don't have to do anything. other than make sure that they stay in attainment. Maintenance areas still have some rules that they are subject to because they are not yet fully classified as attainment. So, these state implementation plans, what do these really involve? A SIP is something that each state must develop, and it's a plan describing how it will both attain and maintain the NACs. So how it will get any of its non-attainment areas into first maintenance and then into non-attainment or into attainment. And in general, SIPs are a collection of programs. They mostly include a monitoring program, sometimes calculations and computer modeling systems, emissions inventories, which we'll talk about next week. Sometimes they are they do serve as the formal adoption of the measures. So once a SIP is approved, it is enforceable by the EPA, it's enforceable by the state government, and it is enforceable by individual citizens. The Clean Air Act gives rights to individual citizens to sue the federal government and their state and local governments for not enforcing the Clean Air Act. And the SIPs are always under periodic review. So usually the state agency that is responsible for it must provide the public an opportunity to review the plan before sending it to EPA for approval. So this isn't so much a case here in South Carolina because we are in attainment for everything. But in places where non-attainment is a big issue, the SIPs will get revised and resubmitted, and there's always a period of time where the public can review it. Just a few quick more definitions. We're going to talk about these more next week. We're going to talk specifically about how do we make an emissions inventory next week. Emissions terms are some of the tools that we use in the Clean Air Act, and there are 3 different terms that mean 3 different things. The first is an emissions inventory, and this is an inventory by source of how much air pollutants are discharged into the atmosphere. So this is how much air pollution does your car put out, plus how much air pollution does my car put out, plus how much air pollution does my house put out, plus how much air pollution does the dam at Lake Murray put out, plus. It is an inventory of everything that is emitted into the air. The emissions factor is a statistical average, and it is by source type. So they're used to compute the emissions inventory and they're activity relevant. So let's use fuel burning for an example. The emissions factor is usually a number given in pounds of pollutant emitted per gallons of fuel used. For agriculture, an emissions factor may be given in grams emitted per area of field worked. So they're an activity relevant number that provides a relationship between the amount of pollution produced and the amount of raw material processed. And then on the other side of that is the emissions standard, which is the maximum amount of air polluting discharge legally allowed from a single source, either mobile or stationary. So this is the number that the Clean Air Act or the state or the federal government or at any part in the process says the car can only put out X amount of carbon monoxide, or X amount of NOx can come out of the tailpipe of this car. So those are the 3 different emission terms. And again, we'll review those again next week. We're going to talk in depth on how you actually come up with an emissions inventory. All right, so that was a brief introduction to the Clean Air Act. Hopefully you have read or will read the Plain English Guide to the Clean Air Act, and then I'm also the Clean Air Act in a nutshell, both of which are great documents to break down the information, what you need to know about the Clean Air Act. So what is our current air quality situation? What does this mean? I'm talking about an act that's now 30 years old since its last major amendment. It's been updated in terms of the emission standards, but it's still been quite a period of time since then. Is it still relevant? Do we still need it? Most of this information comes from the EPA Green Book, that website you just saw on the previous slide. So turns out we're doing pretty well for carbon monoxide and nitrogen oxides, or NO2. we have nitrogen dioxide, sorry. There are no non-attainment areas. Some counties are in maintenance, and many are in attainment. So there's 97 counties in maintenance for carbon monoxide. Those are classified areas, and then 40 counties in maintenance that are non-classified areas, and that affects about 75 million people. For NO2, there are no non-attainment areas, and there is only one part of LA County that's in maintenance for the primary standard. So for those two, we're doing great. Lead, the standard for lead, the 1978 standard, there's one non-attainment area. There's 11 counties around the country in maintenance and about 2 million people that are still affected by lead. Now, the reason I have this 1978 standard here is because that was the last time there was a standard put forth for lead. And we'll see with some of the other pollutants that you may be subject to a different standard. So you could have been, I'll talk about it in a second. Okay, so only one non-attainment area for lead. It's a county it's actually only part of a county in Missouri with less than 5,000 people in it. Lead used to come from cars with leaded gas. We've talked about this. That was completely banned by 1996 for on-road vehicles. It's still allowed in non-road vehicles, but the major sources of lead in the air today are metals processing, leaded aviation gasoline, and that one county is found near a lead smelter. Yeah, that's all I want to tell you about lead. Oh, no. In 2008, the lead standard was revised to be a little bit tighter. And now what this did was put 13 counties in non-attainment for lead based on the 2008 standard. As the standard gets stricter, if you once were in attainment, the standard gets stricter, you can be put into non-attainment. And then you have to follow the rules based on the year that you were put into non-attainment. 11 counties are in maintenance, and these were counties that were, these are the same counties that were in maintenance for the 1978 standard. And you can see where their locations are there. And in most of these, they are only a portion of the counties. Okay. Sulfur dioxide, there's 4 counties in non-attainment for the primary standard and 3 counties for the primary and secondary standard. And you can see them here in the western, and then again here in Warren County, New Jersey, and then this county here in Pennsylvania. I can't remember what the name of this county is. And there are 49 counties that are in maintenance that have improved over time. The 2010 revised SO2 standard puts all of these red dots into non-attainment. So it expanded the standard quite a bit. So all of these counties were redesignated in 2010 as non-attainment. When you're redesignated, that triggers the SIP process to get you back into the below the NACs in all of these areas. Particulate matter, you can see particulate matter counties designated for non-attainment, mostly in Southern California. You can see right here all these serious and moderate counties. New York is a moderate, and other than that, very few PM10. The PM10 standard is still there, but it's more concerned with the PM2.5 standard, which was revised twice in 2006 and then again in 2012. And I'm going to just flip back and forth between these two. Oh, I guess I can't do that. You can see still mostly in California, county here. There have been a number of programs on the national level to work out reduction in particulate matter, emission standards for both mobile and stationary sources. And then there are a number of different rules that were aimed at particulate matter in particular. Some of them voluntary, the National Clean Diesel Campaign to reduce particulate pollution through retrofitting vehicles, and the Smart Way Transport Partnership and Clean School Buses USA. There was also a Great American Wood Stove Changeout, which was a voluntary program to reduce particle pollution from wood stoves by encouraging people to replace They're older stoves with EPA certified stoves. So for PM 2.5, there's been on the national level some incentive programs to reduce emissions, and it's been working pretty well. Still some counties in maintenance and non-attainment. Ozone has gone through a couple of revisions as well. Here's the 8-hour ozone standard map. Ozone, you can see, has the most counties in non-attainment based on the 2015 standard. They are classified by marginal to extreme, severe based on the 2015 standard, and severe based on the 2017 standard. Ozone has been changing. Ozone standards changed quite a bit in the last few years. I think that's all I want to tell you about this. This is okay. So just briefly before I can conclude here, is it working? Short answer, yes. These are the trends in pollutant concentration averages since 1990. So since those last amendments went through, carbon monoxide down by 74%, lead down by 82%, nitrogen dioxide down, annual and 1 hour, ozone down. The ozone is the least improved. 8-hour ozone down only 21%. And that goes back to that complicated ozone situation that we talked about, that there's a lot more chemistry involved in the production of ozone in the atmosphere as we go. Year-to-year changes are influenced by things like dust storms, wildfires, and variations in weather. And if we look at the emissions totals for these, the amount emitted has gone down drastically. Direct emissions of CO, ammonia, nitrogen oxides, particulate matter, sulfur dioxide, and VOC is all down anywhere from 22 to 67%. This is the leaving the source number. So this is pretty great. We have definitely shown progress since the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments. And if we look all the way back to 1970 and look at the bottom line there as the aggregate emissions for the 6 common pollutants, so that's a percent change over all of them. So you can see a reduction in the pollution. You can see a change in CO2 emissions, tied very closely there with our increase in energy consumption. The light blue line there is the population growth. Those 3 lines trend quite next to each other. And then these 2 green lines are also very interesting, how they trend together and show great growth in the economy and in our country while still declining our air pollution burden in the gross domestic product and the vehicle miles traveled. Gross domestic product almost 3 times what it was, 300% what it was in 1970, and the number of vehicle miles traveled moving up quite a bit as well. So you can see growth in the things we want to grow and decrease in the air quality. CO2, I would still argue that these 2 lines here need to get further separated from a climate change perspective. So, answering the question, does it work? Here's the summary. Since 1970, the 6 major ones have decreased. Air toxics have decreased by nearly 70%. New cars are more than 90% cleaner and will be even cleaner in the future. And the production of the most ozone-depleting chemicals has ceased entirely. No more CFCs. And at the same time, the GDP has tripled, energy consumption has increased by 50%, and vehicle use has increased by almost 200%. So we are adapting. The Clean Air Act, since the 1990 amendments, doing a pretty good job. Just briefly, because you are probably tired, I hope you've paused and gotten up and stopped listening to me by now. There are a couple of other regulation issues that have touched on the Clean Air Act and still play a role in our regulation of the air pollutants. And there's 3 areas here. One, the interstate transport issue. So the Clean Air Act amendments of 1970 allowed downwind states to file petitions, and now 22 upwind states are required to address regional ozone transport in their SIPs. And then there's the international transport issue. We do have a formal agreement with Canada. We also have a smaller scale agreement with Mexico, which basically commissioned a study to understand the interstate transport between, or the international transport of pollutants between Mexico and the US and US and Mexico. And then in 1979, there was a Geneva Convention on long-range transboundary air pollution, which was a conglomeration of 51 different countries that had 8 protocols for specific actions. And it really was the first agreement to deal with an international pollution problem. In 1985, it was amended. Member countries were required to reduce their emissions of sulfur and transboundary fluxes of sulfate. And then there was an amendment for nitrogen oxide, and then there was a second sulfur protocol in 1994. And then the last two there are other global issues beyond the Geneva Convention on long-range transboundary air pollution. The Montreal Protocol, we talked briefly about this already. It was an international agreement to reduce CFC emissions. And then in 1992, there was an Earth Summit in Brazil, which led to what's known as the Kyoto Protocol, which is an international agreement linked to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And the major feature of the Kyoto Protocol is that it sets binding targets for 37 industrialized countries in the European community for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. The US did not sign the Kyoto Protocol. And then subsequently, I don't have it on this slide yet, the Paris Agreement of just recently, which was intended to address climate change even more greatly than the Kyoto Protocol. So I'm going to leave you with this, the air pollution system. We've talked about this in the past. Emissions from the sources. This is a place where we can control, and we can control with emissions standards and emissions regulations on specific pollutants. So this is a technology control. It goes through the atmosphere, the meteorology, which we don't have much control over, and then the receptors, what people receive, and this is where we control the ambient air quality. So the Clean Air Act does put controls both here on what can be emitted and here on what can be received, and the balance between those is what really helps us have clean air. The doubled approach there is what makes it great in that sense. All right, that's it. Please email me with any questions. Have a great one.